Good evening. This is Devvy Kidd, and we have a special guest tonight. I'm so happy to say, and so blessed to have as my friend. Let me give you a little background about Dr. Edwin Vieira. He holds 4 degrees from Harvard, an AB, Harvard College, AM, and PhD from Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and JD, which is Harvard Law School. For more than 30 years, he practiced law with the emphasis on constitutional issues. In the Supreme Court of the United States, he successfully argued or briefed the cases leading to the landmark decisions Abood versus Detroit Board of Education, Chicago Teachers Union v. Hudson, and Communication Workers of America v. Beck, which established constitutional and statutory limitations on the uses to which labor unions in both the private and public sectors may apply fees extracted from non-union workers as a condition of their employment. Edwin has written, I can't even begin to tell you how many monographs and articles in scholarly journals and lectured throughout the country. His book, Pieces of Aid, is 2 volumes titled The Monetary Powers and Disabilities of the Constitution. It is the most comprehensive study in existence of American monetary law and history viewed from a constitutional perspective. I read it all the way through, and then I went through it the second time, and so it's full of yellow Post-its because I learned from his books. He also co-authored under a nom de plume of the political novel Crash Maker, A Federal Affair. Great book. It's a not-so-fictional story of an engineered crash of the Federal Reserve System and the political upheaval it causes. It really is an excellent book, but it's very long. He also wrote How to Dethrone the Imperial Judiciary. I highly recommend that book. It isn't that long, and judicial corruption is just absolutely rampant in this country. In the last 221 years, only 8 federal judges have been removed from the bench. It's really a sad legacy on the U.S. Congress. And his last book is Constitutional Homeland Security, Volume 1, The Nation in Arms, and Edwin is working on Volume 2. Hi, Edwin. Welcome to the show.
My pleasure to be with you, Devvy.
I always appreciate you taking your time to help all of us understand the critical issues that are going on today, because we're literally fighting tooth and nail to stop what's going on. But I specifically asked if you could come on tonight to help all of us understand. As you know, the internet has been burning up since Friday, March 16th, when Obama signed this executive order called the National Defense Resources Preparedness. And people went literally into a panic. I mean, gun sales went right through the roof. Everybody was convinced that there was going to be martial law tomorrow. It's my understanding, and I'm going to give you the mic after this, that there was a few words added that has caused the panic, being, I believe it was peacetime, besides just national emergency. So can you talk about that, please?
Sure. This executive order was signed on the 16th of March of this year, and it's called the National Defense Resources Preparedness Executive Order. So that's it. Its subtitle. And you can find this without too much difficulty on the internet if you go to the White House.
We're gonna have to go to a break. So please hold that thought. Don't go away, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be right back, and Edwin will get to it.
Pick up your sword and shield. Get on the battlefield. Satan's armies come to kill. This is war. Satan's army roams the land, seeking souls of fallen men.
We're back after the break. I hope. The producer's been helping me out. If you just tuned in, I'm Devvy Kidd, and I'm filling in for Pastor Butch. And so bear with me a little bit. Our guest is Dr. Edwin Vieira. Edwin, could we please pick up where we left off before the break?
Well, I was just saying that this executive order is available on the White House website for those who want to find it. March 16th, 2012 is the date. Now, actually, most of this derives from an earlier executive order that President Clinton, Bill Clinton, put out And then there were earlier orders that actually go all the way back to a statute called the Defense Production Act of 1950. So we're not talking here about something that was just created by people in the Obama administration. It's been around quite a while, and there have been a number of amendments of this over the years. And basically what it's designed to do is to assert, because I don't think they have this power legitimately, but to assert what essentially amounts to a complete control over the entire American economy as the foundation for maintaining what's been popularly called the military-industrial complex. And you see, as you read through this thing, that's the constant theme, coming back to defense production, defense equipment, people involved in defense industries, labor that may be employed for that purpose. So really that's what we're looking at here is essentially a blueprint or a template for how, in some kind of extreme national emergency, the government in Washington, along obviously with the people in the Pentagon, would come in and try to control, for the benefit of the national defense establishment, the entire economy of the country. Now, I shrug my shoulders when I see something like that. I think that's really imaginary, a fantastic view of what they think they're capable of doing, given how complex the economy is. But that's the way these people think. Now, this particular executive order does two things slightly different from the earlier Clinton order. One of them, it really incorporates and makes clear the Department of Homeland Security's involvement in this, Secretary of Homeland Security, and there's a National Security Council and Homeland Security Council they're talking about. So this is an update in that sense, that we've now come through the end of the Clinton years, of course, into the Bush years, in which the Department of Homeland Security was created, and now they're updating this to bring this entire structure in line with the new Homeland Security structure. Now, there's one other little vignette, as it were, that's dropped into this. In Section 102, for instance, when they talk about the policy of this, they now apparently have added the words "in peacetime" and "in times of national emergency." So some people are becoming very exercised about those words "in peacetime," suggesting that perhaps the earlier version of this really didn't apply to peacetime. I don't know about that, because national emergency, that's kind of magic language that they use to try to cover any power grab that they think up. National emergency has never been defined to be limited to wartime. I mean, you had the national emergency way back when, in the 1930s, when Roosevelt came in 1933, and that was entirely an economic and banking phenomena that was behind the national emergency. And we've had a number of other national emergencies, obviously without any declaration of war, because there hasn't been a declaration of war by the United States Congress since World War II. And yet there have been one national emergency after another following World War II. So I'm not sure exactly why they put that in, except maybe to cover them, maybe in a situation where they felt they couldn't sell the idea that there was really an emergency, but nonetheless they wanted to take some actions under this executive order. They put in the word peacetime. And the thing that comes to my mind right there is something along the lines of the economic problems that we had with the first TARP bailout. Remember way back there with the end of the Bush administration. You would look at that and say, well, maybe that didn't rise to the level of what one would call a national emergency, in the sense that those words had been used in the past. But it was certainly something they considered to be extremely serious. And you can imagine that kind of underlying problem and the effects that it would have on the defense industries in this country. And at that stage, some of these actions that are outlined in the executive order might be taken. My point about all this is, we've let them come a long way. This is, as I said before, this is from 1950, from the Defense Production Act of 1950, which was the source of the congressional authority for the presidents to begin putting out executive orders of this type. So we're talking about, like 60 years before people are finally waking up and saying, well, there's something wrong here. Of course there is. they're asserting far too much authority in the executive branch, in fact, far too much authority coming out of Congress. And you look at this and you say, well, this is something that looks like the 5-year plans or the 10-year plans of the Soviet Union in terms of the way they're centralizing or purporting to centralize all control over production with respect to national defense. When we think about that, too, how far does that go? Almost every element of production, because this thing lists farming, it lists control over water, control over transportation, control over material services and facilities, construction materials, energy, health and human services, all the health resources involved. All of those, of course, can tie in, and that essentially absorbs like a sponge almost the entire economy of the country. The one thing that's interesting that isn't in here is specific control over the monetary and banking system. They seem to have left that in the hands of the wise man in the Federal Reserve, although they do have in this particular executive order provisions to give loans and loan guarantees and subsidy payments and so forth and so on. So there's some financial aspects to it too. But I would say if I were writing one of these, kind of a wish list of power, the one thing that I would say in there is, well, I want to have control over the monetary system. If the monetary system collapses, the entire production system will collapse, the defense system will collapse. We can't leave the monetary system in the hands of these people in Wall Street and the people in the Federal Reserve, but they have, which I think tells you who are the real powers behind the scenes here. Those people don't seem to come under control, but essentially everybody else in this country potentially could come under control through this executive order or one similar to it in the next one that they put out. But I don't think that, to close off on this comment, I don't think that this is, as it were, the end of the world right now, because it is not that different from what Clinton had, because he didn't have the Secretary of Homeland Security, so that's the difference, but that's an organizational question. And the words in peacetime, which I don't believe were in there anywhere in the Clinton executive order, but I really don't think that makes a tremendous amount of difference in terms of what they would claim that they'd be able to do.
Well, it's even without the words in peacetime, it's overwhelming when you look at it. I mean, it really looks like the Sovietization of the United States.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the problem. If you look at this thing now, the question I would ask these people who are coming out on the internet and being, as the French say, catastrophized, right? Catastrophe, the world's falling, the sky is falling. I'd say, where were you, back in the Clinton administration? Or before the Clinton administration? This thing was not invented by the Obama administration. It's been cleaned up a little bit and gussied up a little bit to fit administrative changes that came out of the Bush administration. So it's a continuum. That's what we're seeing here. We're seeing a continuum of absorption of power, centralization of power, personalization of power, taking power away from the people, first sucking it up into Congress, and then Congress is transferring this power to the executive branch, and then the executive branch really is looking like that single Caesaristic figure, right? We look to the Obamas, the Bushes, the Clintons, this man on the white horse, and of course here we have an executive order that ultimately, I suppose, gives him the authority to make all sorts of decisions. But I think the reality here, of course, is all of these people that are listed, the secretary of this and the secretary of that, and then eventually the Pentagon, those are the folks who are going to be making the decisions, the nameless, faceless bureaucrats in these huge agencies who have been elected by no one. We don't even know who they are. If your life depended on it, you couldn't name a dozen of them. And yet they have control of all the levers, potentially, of the entire economy of the United States.
Well, I can say, and I feel comfortable saying this, that I read, probably just like you, the hysteria that immediately launched over the Internet. I call it yellow journalism. Instead of analyzing this, and one thing that I learned from you and from Larry Beecraft and, other attorneys, as far as doing research on these types of things, I learned this a long time ago. When these executive orders are issued, there's always a trail So you have to go back and look at what the statutes or the executive order said before, or public law or whatever. So you have to backtrack, just like you were talking about. It went back to the Clinton administration, and back before that it was, massaged by the Bush administration. So it goes back almost 60 years. And so when I read these splashy headlines that have people so upset, two things come to mind. Number one, that these so-called patriots out there, which I'm going to probably get a lot of bad email for, the quest or the fight for freedom and liberty has become nothing but a cottage industry where people are out to make money with splashy headlines on their websites so they get more hits, so they sell more products, this, that, and the other. And second of all is that they are not intellectually, prepared to analyze this like you are. We're going to the break. Please don't go away. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. Very important for our advertisers, for the advertisers.
Satan's army roams the land, seeking souls of fallen men.
Okay, hopefully that this is my signal to come back on. This is Devvy filling in for Pastor Butch with Dr. Edwin Vieira. Edwin, I just want to read you a couple, three little short sentences, because, and then we're going to, this segues into the next part. As I was saying, the hysteria out there is unbelievable. This is just one of them. Why was this executive order issued now? Is there a growing sense of hatred of their government? Is there a coming natural disaster for which we're unaware? Are there plans for martial law? And I can't tell you, I must have sent out 200 links to your column that you wrote for newswithviews.com. And for listeners, Edwin's scholarly columns on newswithviews.com, everybody in the country should read them. So if you just go to newswithviews.com, and on the left side, you'll see the roster of writers. See Dr. Edwin Vieira. But this particular one you wrote August 31st, 2009, I didn't really understand everything about martial law till I read your column. And when I saw all this hysteria on the internet, and of course we should be concerned about anything coming out of the White House, but, we don't want to see people make mistakes that can ruin their lives, go off half-cocked and start trouble because they think martial law is coming down the pike tomorrow. So can you give us an overview of our primer, I should say, on martial law so folks can understand it better?
Well,
people are under the impression, Edwin, that a sitting president can just pick up the phone and say, I'm declaring martial law across the United States. It doesn't work that way.
No, not at all. And in fact, the grave difficulty you have is even defining what that means. Because if you look at the president's position as commander-in-chief, because usually that's where people start. He's the commander-in-chief, controls the Army, controls the Navy. Therefore, he has some authority to declare martial law. Well, the Army and the Navy are constructs of Congress. They don't have an independent existence. Congress has the power to raise and support armies, provide and maintain a Navy, and they wouldn't exist unless Congress exercised that power. And Congress also has the power to make rules for the governance regulation of the Army and Navy. So when the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy that Congress has created, he can act only within the limits of those rules that Congress has made for the Army and the Navy. And it's pretty simple. The President doesn't have some kind of independent authority as Commander-in-Chief because he always has to look back to what Congress has done in either the creation of those entities or in the specific rules for regulating their behavior. And of course, the same is true with the militia, although we really don't have a militia, but in principle, President is Commander-in-Chief of the militia when the militia are called into the active service of the United States, which is only for 3 limited purposes, and even then there's a provision in the Constitution that gives Congress the power to provide rules for the governance of the militia. So even there, the President is also controlled. And obviously the military people themselves can't do anything outside of those rules that Congress has enacted for them within the Army, Navy, Marine, whatever the structure is. So if you look at this from a constitutional perspective, you have to ask the question, well, what in heaven's name are they talking about? And usually the picture that comes to mind is a situation in which, for some reason, the obvious one being, well, maybe there's actual combat in the area of a war situation, or you might have some natural disaster on the other side. The civilian authorities in a particular area have been driven out, or they've been destroyed, or they simply can't function. And so the only people that you would have to bring in there, because, of course, once again, we don't have a properly structured militia in this country, the only people who might be available to come in and assert some kind of order into the situation through force would be the Army, the military people. All right. So you can conceive of that situation, but then the question is, what should the burden be on them in terms of enforcing law in that particular area? And the correct answer would be, well, to the extent that it can be done, and probably can be done to a very large extent, they should function in the same way that local police function, because they're essentially going to be enforcing the same types of laws that local police would enforce. And then if there aren't courts and other civilian agencies immediately available to deal with the individuals who might be apprehended, looting, or whatever it might be, they simply hold them in custody until those courts are restored to operation, turn them over to the civilian authorities. And I give you the classic example of this, Douglas MacArthur, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. We'll talk about this after the break.
Edwin, yeah, I'm sorry. The sponsors are very important, so we'll be right back. Don't go away.
Pick up your sword and shield. Get on the battlefield. Satan's armies come to kill. This is war. Satan's army roams the land, seeking souls of fallen men.
America's #1 source for independent talk radio for over a decade. We are the GCN Radio Network.
And I cried, oh my God, what have we done to allow such abuse to exist? Yes, I cried, oh my God, what have we done to allow
This is Stevie. I hope I'm doing this right again after the break. Thank you, the producer. I know we have a couple of callers, but I would like for Edwin to just go ahead and complete this little part about General MacArthur, and then we'll take a couple of calls. Go ahead, Edwin.
The point I want to make is, in our system, civilian law is always superior to military law. And MacArthur gives you the classic example of someone who understood that fully. 1944, invasion of the island of Leyte in the Philippines. There were thousands of Japanese troops on that island, and more were pouring in. It was a very long battle to take it over. MacArthur cleared out one part of the island, brought in the Filipino leading political figures, restored the government, civilian government of the Philippines right there at that moment. Same thing in the Korean War. The North Koreans had pretty much taken over the entire territory of South Korea. Our forces and the Koreans were in the Pusan perimeter. MacArthur invaded Incheon, recaptured the Korean capital, Seoul, and no sooner had he done that than he restored the Korean civilian government, even though that conflict was still going on, went on for quite a long time because, of course, the Red Chinese came into it. So he was a classic example of this. And the third example, when he went to Japan as the head of the occupying forces, one of the first things he did there was to restore civil rights, freedom of the press. And then he helped the Japanese to develop a constitution, actually quite what I would call liberal constitution in the true sense of the word, in the sense of our founding fathers. So MacArthur shows you the way it should be done, with the military serving to bring civilian control back into those areas where, because of circumstances, the only thing that could have been done at the time was to have initial military control. Our difficulty is we don't have people of the caliber of Douglas MacArthur in our system anymore. Or at least if we do, they're not out front in control.
No, as the late Colonel David Hackworth said, we have a bunch of perfumed princes out there. All right, well, let's take a call. The producer can help me on this. Hello, caller. Caller, go ahead. You're on the air.
Am I on the air now?
Yes, you are.
I've been trying to get a phone number for each of you for quite some time. Nobody seems to have it. If either one of you could make that possible, I'll leave a number off the air, or I could leave my number. I might not have time to explain everything. But my thinking is the best solution to keep the federal government in check is with the constitutional sheriffs, which I've been calling about to the talk show host, trying to get them to interview sheriffs across the country to see which ones are respecting our rights and know their power. Sheriff Mack, who had a convention January 30th in Las Vegas, Nevada, had about 100 or more sheriffs and police chiefs there, and he has said in the past that if the sheriffs use their power, they could make Washington, D.C. irrelevant.
Okay. And we're going to provide an answer for you, and thank you very much for calling in. Appreciate it. And I'm glad that the caller brought this up, because it is going into the direction I wanted to go. There's some misconceptions out there about when you say constitutional sheriffs. Now, I know Richie Mack, and I'm fully aware of the convention that went on and all of the good that they're trying to do and educate other sheriffs about the Constitution and about their duties. But the word sheriff doesn't appear in what document, Edwin?
Well, it certainly doesn't appear in the Constitution of the United States. And there's your major problem. The sheriffs, from the perspective of the Constitution of the United States, are not on the same plane as the government in Washington. They're not on the same plane even as their own states. I'll give you an example. Here in Virginia, the sheriff is a constitutional officer because the Constitution of Virginia requires us to have sheriffs in various counties. But the powers of the sheriff are then determined by the General Assembly. What I think these people are looking for ultimately is a different source of power, which is the militia of the several states. Those are the establishments that are specified in the Constitution. They have the same permanence as the states, as Congress, as the president, as the court system. And if you're talking about security, because we're always talking about homeland security, that's the mantra now that they're throwing out. Where is the one place that the noun security appears in the Constitution? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Now, I think in the process of bringing the militia back to their correct constitutional position in this country, sheriffs could play an important role. Because, of course, in many places in the country, they are still in a position to call out the so-called posse comitatus, power of the county, right? Which is essentially every able-bodied man or woman that the sheriff might summon to assist him in enforcing the law. And that's, as a practical matter, that's about a step and a half away from a militia structure. Because, of course, a militia brings every able-bodied man and woman, except the militia structure has a different, actually a higher, more complete set of powers. But you could certainly have states where the sheriffs could begin to take the authority that they already have, start organizing people in their communities, start getting their communities to thinking about self-organization around the sheriff's department. And then at some stage down the line, if the proper state statute can be drafted to revitalize the militia, then you can take what those sheriffs have developed and essentially fold it right into the militia structure. And in fact, I would probably suggest that in many of these instances, the sheriffs could be made what they used to call the head of the militia in the colonial period, the county lieutenant. And so you could bring the sheriff right in and give him some further authority as one of the chief officers in the militia. So there's a lot that can be done with the sheriffs, but I think that people who are looking for the sheriffs as the be-all and the end-all, I think that they're, as I say, one and a half steps away from where they really need to be. I like Sheriff Mack. I mean, I've met him on a couple of occasions, heard him speak. He's he's a very good man, and I think he's moving in the right direction. But we need to get a little more focus on where the real power is localized in the U.S. Constitution.
Absolutely. And this I did not understand until I read your material starting in 2005, because I've always been a supporter of the Second Amendment. But I didn't fully understand what the Second Amendment meant. I obviously knew that it didn't mean that Second Amendment was created so you could get your hunting rifle out up in Wisconsin, and go out and hunt for bear. What I didn't understand was the part about the free state, the necessity of the militia. And of course, big money outfits like the Southern Poverty Law Center and others have maligned anybody who dares mention the word militia. But of course, that's by design. But for common people like me and, the listeners, the militia of the several states is critically important. You and I have been on this for years. Now, last year, the state of Arizona, and I hope that we had a part in this because I sent dozens of the CD off my website, which is free, that has your columns on it, to some of the senators there. So they passed a skeletal, I guess lack of a better word, skeletal bill that unfortunately didn't have any command structure to it, didn't have any funding. Now, I know that they updated it this year, which is a little bit better, but if you had written it, it would be perfect. But people don't understand the militia in the sense that it complements local law enforcement. It's not about taking over the government or going to war with the government. Can you explain to the listeners about the militia of the several states and keeping the states free in what time we have left?
Right, well, let's go back to the Second Amendment.
Okay.
Most people know the Second Amendment, right to the people keeping bear arms shall not be infringed. Why do we have that right there? Well, in order to understand that, you have to look at the clause that precedes it. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. That's why the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, because the people keeping and bearing arms personally are the militia. And the militia the Founding Fathers understood was necessary to the security of what? A police state? No. The security of a free state. Right? So it's all encapsulated right there, because what we're talking about is the ultimate power of self-government. I hate to quote this guy, but he was right on. Mao Zedong, probably the most famous thing he ever said, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. And that's what the Second Amendment says, but it says it with a moral overtone. Political power rightfully grows out of the barrel of a gun when the people exercise that power in order to secure a free state. There's the essence of it. Now, we don't have that kind of structure today. The people essentially are sitting like couch potatoes, as the expression goes, allowing other people to exercise these various security functions, whether it's from the Department of Homeland Security at the top all the way down to maybe a local county police department. Utterly wrong. The structure is not from the top down. The constitutional structure is from the bottom up. Self-government is self-government by the people. The base of the pyramid is where the power is, not at the top of the pyramid. And if you had a properly structured militia in each state, those police departments, those sheriff's departments, would actually be subsets of the militia, in the way the Rangers were, the Minutemen were. You think back to these colonial units, elite units, and they'd have their sheriff's badges, and they'd have their police uniforms, and so forth and so on. But they would be part of the militia performing particular functions, and that particular function would be, in the case of the police, obviously, patrolling and that type of thing. But the beauty of having them under the militia is now they would be subject to control by whom? Well, by the people themselves, right? Because they're now part of this larger organization in which they have to be responsive to those other members of the organization. I think back to New York City back in the Lindsay era, way back now. And they were having all sorts of problems there. The black people in New York were complaining about police discrimination and police brutality and so forth and so on. And Lindsay, this liberal, comes along and he sets up a civilian review board to take a look at what the police are doing. Well, of course, it had no teeth, all right? So nothing happened, ultimately. Well, the ultimate civilian review board is the militia structure. You have a militia structure, I'll tell you what you'll have. You'll have honest elections because the militia will supervise it. You'll have an end to any kind of police brutality and wrongdoing because those police units and sheriff's units will be part of the militia and subject to militia control. You'll have complete transparency, at least in your state and local politicians, because those individuals will have exemptions from certain parts of their militia duty in order to perform their official functions, and as a consequence of those exemptions, they will be required to make reports to the militia as to what they're doing in office. Get that picture? So now we have transparency of public office. I could go down a whole list of these because I have them in the book that's coming out, I hope, shortly. And we have lost all of that for a very simple reason, that the organizational structure that was there in the past with every adult, able-bodied, because it was men in the colonial period, because women weren't legally emancipated, but women would be in it now. Every able-bodied adult from 16 to 55 or 60, when you get to be too old, will have some function to perform. Not necessarily the same function. As I said, the people who are in the police will still be performing their police functions, except they'll have another badge or something with a militia title on them. People who might be doing controlling of elections, different function. And on we go, depending on what your talents are, what your age is, what you can contribute. We could actually make this system work much better than they had it in the colonial period. Remember that in the colonial period, that was their homeland security structure. And they had a few regular troops. The British sometimes sent over regular troops, and the various colonies would sometimes raise regular troops. But their major homeland security defense system was the militia. We have more people. We have better technology. Our people are healthier, probably, I would hope, better educated, generally speaking, at least technologically. We have so many of them that we wouldn't have to cause people to spend a tremendous amount of time from their normal pursuits in performing militia functions. I mean, this is probably the first time in world history when you could really make it work. And if people want to understand what it would look like, a modern militia, all you have to do is look at the Swiss example. The Swiss have been doing this since, what, the 1200s or the 1300s? And I don't think even the Southern Poverty Law Center looks at Switzerland and says, well, they're all a bunch of crazy extremists.
Well, they're in it for the money. I mean, we know what they're all about. But
I know about that. I mean,
one of the things
nobody dares to criticize the militia in Switzerland as being some kind of a crackpot organization.
Well, because the militia inside the states is a direct threat to the power structure in Washington, D.C. But one of the things that always stuck out in my mind, and I have the column in front of me, it was one of your first ones in 2005 on newswithviews.com, was when you talked about individuals who become part of the militia. We're talking about potentially millions of Americans who would get an education on the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, what does the Bill of Rights mean? In other words, they would have this training so that they would understand what their role is and come to realize exactly how far afield, the Congress with the signature of whatever sitting president, and the danger of this police state that's being erected around us. I always remember that in your column because there are so many Americans who have a good heart. They want to do something. They're realizing that things are getting very out of control. But to me, this was just a perfect opportunity to reach so many people and bring us back into line with the way it used to be, for lack of better words. But go ahead, Edwin.
Basically, that would be the first function of the militia as people are brought into it, is educating them in terms of, well, why are you here? What are you supposed to be doing? How does this tie in to our organic documents, as lawyers call the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, right? These foundational documents. What's the purpose of this in the big picture? It's not simply some kind of local security or dealing with natural disasters or whatever. I mean, that's the implementation. But the ultimate goal brings us back to those words in the Second Amendment, the security of a free state.
Okay, we'll pick that up on the other side, so don't go away, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be right back.
Hear me what I'm saying. Pick up your sword and shield. Get on the battlefield. Satan's armies come to kill. This is war. Satan's army roams the land, seeking souls of fallen men. Almost heaven, West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountain, Shenandoah River.
I love that song that I'm going to break in here because we're in our last segment. And before we run out of time, thank you to Pastor Butch for allowing me this opportunity to bring Dr. Edwin Vieira on the air. And Edwin, we only have a few minutes left, so you have the microphone till the end of the show, so go ahead.
Well, the one thing that I would tell the people who are listening in, essentially to put a cap on what we've been discussing, our problem today is that they in Washington, for whatever reason, are developing a first-class police state mechanism centered around the Department of Homeland Security, and they're tying into this as well the regular armed forces, because I think they understand that they don't really have enough, as the expression goes, boots on the ground to be able to deal with what I believe they foresee is coming, and rightly so, a very, very serious economic crisis. If it's something along the lines of hyperinflation, breakdown of the total banking system, you can imagine what the consequences will be in the area of production, in the area of employment. You'll have a tremendous amount of civil unrest, civil disobedience, in fact, and that's what they're foreseeing. The difficulty is that top-down, bureaucratically centralized plan is not going to work. The greater the crisis is, in fact, the less likely it's going to work. The only ultimate protection, if you assume that some crisis like that is looming over the horizon, is organization of very large numbers of people in their local communities where obviously the effects of the crisis will be felt. And then you're talking about the constitutional structure called the militia of the several states, one in each one of the 50 states. And that's what the Founding Fathers' experience had been. Local security, that's what they believed was necessary to maintain freedom, because you were going to have the ultimate power of self-government in the hands of the people themselves, not in the hands of some representatives, or even worse, some kind of bureaucrats. And that's what needs to be restored. The Constitution is a very complex structure. And the way I look at it, it's like a building that has a number of support pillars. And the main support pillar, it's telling us, the main support pillar are these institutions called the militia, because they are necessary to the security of a free state. The only thing the Constitution says is necessary for any purpose whatsoever. Read the Constitution and see if you can find that it says anything else is necessary to the security of a free state. If you pull that support pillar out, any architect will tell you the building eventually is going to come down. Especially if that building is being hit with earthquakes or tornadoes or whatever, some kind of external shock. If you remove the main support pillar, forget it. And that's exactly the situation we have now. We've gotten along for a long time without having a proper militia structure, really since the turn of the 20th century. 1903 was the statute that really began the process. But our problems have increased exponentially. And now we are looking at some kind of major economic meltdown, and probably won't simply be here in the United States. It looks like it's going to have worldwide implications. And I don't think anyone has any conception of the chaos that may be generated from that kind of an event, except the people in Washington are saying to themselves, well, we have big trouble, and we want to keep a lid on. We want to put the screws on, and we're going to use the classic method of the bureaucratic mind, suppression, repression, oppression, whichever word you want to use, police control from the top down. And of course, once that kind of a system fastens on a country, in the course of a major economic crisis. It may be generations until people can free themselves again.
Thank you, Edwin. We're out of time. It's a quick hour. I very much appreciate you being the guest tonight. And good night, everybody.
Great, Devvy. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Satan's army roams the land, seeking souls of